From being a young child, I was always aware that we were a very small family because there were never many presents at Christmas. We never got many cards because, as far as I was concerned, my father had been orphaned. So there was only my mother and father, and I had a brother, and I had one grandmother. I didn't have a grandfather. I knew, obviously, there was a grandfather, but all I knew briefly is that he'd been a Belgian soldier who was recuperating at Temple Newsam in Leeds. We don't know what his war wounds were, or his injuries, or whether it was physical, mental. And we're not even sure how old he is. He may have been in the Second World War as well, I don't know.
Cyril Dusagy was a Belgian soldier who was wounded in the First World War, and lots of Belgian wounded soldiers ended up being cared for in Britain because they couldn't be cared for in Belgium. So they ended up in British hospitals. Temple Newsam was an auxiliary hospital. Like lots of great houses in the First World War, it was converted into an auxiliary hospital. It's a convalescent hospital really, to care for wounded men. And it particularly at the beginning cared for Belgians. So it had Belgian officers, and Cyril with other Belgian officers would have ended up here being cared for as he recovered.
Temple Newsam's time as a hospital during the First World War is really the last time that it's lived in and that it's full of life. Up to 50 patients were in the bedrooms upstairs at any one time. We know from its history that it was full of people who were poorly, but they were getting better. So that people were playing tennis outside, they were playing drafts, writing letters, organising evening recitals. So from 1915 to 1917, when it's an auxiliary hospital, Temple Newsam is really brought to life.
A few years before my mother died, I suggested that she might like to write a life story because there were a lot of things she was talking about in a very early life, and it did tie in with my grandmother and this grandfather that I'd never seen or knew nothing about. And as she wrote it, I sort of read it, and that was the first time I really started to pick up the story. So from what I could make out, my grandmother was working as a living servant at Beeston in Leeds, and at some point she met this Belgian soldier who was called Cyril Dusagy, and they became engaged. And my mother tells me there was an engagement ring which came from Cyril's family's jewellery business in Belgium. So they'd got that far down the path. But then my grandmother, Elizabeth, or Lizzie as we always called her, became pregnant before they were actually married. Now I do know that Cyril did want to marry her, but for some reason my grandmother refused him. Then there was a problem of the baby. Lizzie daredn't tell her father because she knew what he would have done. So she told her mother, and she told one of her sisters, and it was decided that she should go back to Northern Ireland, where the family had come from in 1892. They moved to England, and she should have the baby there. Now, I don't know if Cyril had any input on that decision, but anyway, she went, and my mother was born in May 1919 in Waterside Infirmary in Londonderry, and after about 6 months my grandmother came back to England but had no contact with the family at all. She was just an outcast, so only her mother and her sister knew about the baby. Now, Cyril, we don't know at what point he'd gone back to Belgium. We don't know whether he actually saw the baby. There's no photographs of him with the baby. There's photographs of me grandmother with my mother as a very small baby. But Cyril obviously knew the baby existed because he continued to write from Belgium to my grandmother. Now, he couldn't have written directly Because of my grandmother's situation, an unmarried mother with a small child trying to find living domestic work, she took off to the Dales. I think Otley was where they first started. So Cyril could never have written to her direct, so I assume it must have all gone through Mother. But anyway, he continued to write, and he wrote little cards, like very small notelets that we have today, but they were decorated. And they were addressed to my mother by name, so he obviously knew the name of the baby. And the cards say things like, "To my darling daughter Margaret, won't it be wonderful when you're here with me next Christmas?" and things like that. And to my grandmother as well, "To my darling Lizzie, when are you coming here?" You know. But she never went. Now, whether it was too big a step, obviously I only knew her in later life, and she was a very independent, strong woman, and whether that had any influence, I don't know, but it could have just been it was too big a step. Even though she'd no family here now, she was completely cut off.
War throws people together, it moves people around, and we know that the First World War produced a lot of romances, a lot of relationships, a lot of quite quick marriages as well. Sometimes people were quite keen to marry who were called up in case they were killed, and so their wives could get the military pension. But also it's just because people were meeting each other in new circumstances. Their story is interesting, I think, because there were definitely some stories of Belgians and British women getting together, but I know that it didn't end as happily. So when Cyril went back to Belgium, for whatever reason, Lizzie didn't join him. I know of one other case where that happened, actually, in Leeds, where there'd been, I understand, a proposal, but she also hadn't wanted to go back to Belgium. And I suppose at the time we have to think that Belgium in 1918, 1919 after the war was not necessarily a great prospect. It had been completely devastated by the conflict. In terms of the landscape, you know, if you think if you'd come from a farming family, your farm would have been completely destroyed if it had been in that zone. We also know that there was some food shortages, a lot of the houses had been destroyed. It was a difficult place to go back to, as well as being foreign, you know, for a British woman who might not speak French or Flemish. So I can imagine that it would have been a difficult decision whether or not there was a child involved, which in this case there was. Obviously, if you had decided to remain a single parent in the 1919, 1920, that was also a difficult decision because there was a stigma, it was difficult financially. A lot of single women were dependent on professions like domestic service, where actually it was very difficult to have a child with you. So all I can imagine is that it must have been a very difficult time and a very difficult decision.
My grandmother took to wearing a wedding ring and simply said, "Oh, my husband sadly died in the war," and that was her cover. But she seemed, from my mother's story, continually moving on. She had to put my mother in an orphanage for 3 years when my mother was about 5. The coincidence is that the card stopped when my mother went into the orphanage. So maybe there's a link there. Maybe the cards didn't stop, but my mother just never got them. Or I don't know what might have happened to Cyril. His injuries may have been worse than what we know. I don't know how to find out when people die in Belgium because we don't know where he was.
One of the main characters who was looking after the house as a hospital is Lady Dorothy Wood. She's the wife of the Honourable Edward Wood, and he had inherited Temple Newsam. We know that Lady Wood was the commandant of Temple Newsam when it was an auxiliary hospital, and this meant that she was in charge of all the day-to-day running of the house as a hospital. We know that she found it very time-consuming, and it was just one of her roles. She was also on the board for land use in Leeds. She also used to be very active in encouraging young men to sign up and young women to volunteer as well, and she was very conscious that everyone should do their bit. There's some really nice reporting at the time in magazines like The Gentlewoman, for example, that talks about Lady Wood and how she sacrificed so much to run the hospital at Temple Newsam. She cooks for her family by herself on a Primus stove. A whole wing of the house has been given over to a hospital, and that she no longer wears her jewellery, and that she only wears her string of pearls. which I think is very much of its time and of its class as well.
I think when people bring personal items like the postcards that Michael has from his family, or other people might have letters or diaries that have been passed down in families, there are an awful lot from the First World War. I think they open up the war in a way that other things can't. So official records that we have, for example Red Cross records or military records, that's when people pass through the administration and we have the trail of paperwork that's left behind. But personal connections and letters and diaries give us a different way into that experience, and they make us, I think, identify with them and their hopes and their dreams and their feelings in a way that official records never can. So from a historical point of view, we always need both. We need those kind of personal memoirs to individualise the experience, and so it's not just from the kind of top-down perspective. Like all wars, the First World War moved lots of people about, and one of them was the refugees who came from Belgium when it was invaded by Germany. So in 1914 and 1915 there were about 250,000 Belgian refugees who came over to the UK, and about 10,500 of them came to Yorkshire, and they formed all sorts of relationships with the local populations. In this case, as we know, sometimes there were romancers and children born of those romancers, but there are surprisingly actually few traces of those relationships and the 4 long years that a lot of the refugees spent here. So most of the refugees from Belgium went back to Belgium after the war. Around 90% we think actually went back, and only a few stayed. So that's why they're so exciting and interesting, is because they show some of the impact of that massive movement of people who were forced to flee their own home country and came to be in Britain for the duration of the war.
Cyril must have had an address for Margaret and Lizzie to write to him. So we had this address in Belgium, and it does appear, I think, on some of the cards and notelets. So it was always assumed that was his house. Now in the 1970s, my mother had a friend who was going to that part of Belgium who offered to look up this address for her. And then when this person came back, she said, "Oh, it's a nursing home now." So he assumed it was a family house, and that it was a big house, and it had been converted into a nursing home. But what I discovered only a few months ago, having given these cards to somebody to look at, said no, it was always nursing home, hospital. So when Cyril was writing from there, he wasn't writing from his home address. But my mother always assumed that. I don't know whether my grandmother knew that, but when my mother asked this person to go and look it up, she said, well, that's where my father lived. So she always thought it was the family house. And she died thinking that, because it was only a few months ago that I found out that it wasn't the family address, it just happened to be where Cyril went back to. So we don't even know where his roots are. People get hospitalised miles from where they actually live.
We're hoping with Michael's story, and with other people who've worked with academics like me who are studying the First World War, that we might be able to find some more information out for him. There's more and more becoming available, and even though it's been quite difficult actually to trace what happened to people after the war, because the records are more available for during the war, we're hoping that we can find out some more.
The First World War had a big impact on the entire family, as it was even before Lizzie, my grandmother, had met Cyril, because 2 of Lizzie's brothers had been killed in the war in 1917. So that had a big impact. And then at some point just after that, Cyril and Lizzie met, and again it was the war that brought them together, because had we not been coming towards the end of the First World War, Cyril would not have been fighting in either France or Belgium, would not have been injured, and would not have ended up needing to be at Temple Newsam to recuperate. The influence it's had on my life has generally been a lack of family. When as I was growing up, everybody seemed to have lots of grandparents and aunties and uncles, and I didn't have any. Or so I thought. I thought there was no more family. It was only in later life, when I started to research the family tree, that I realised just how big a family tree I could make without too much effort. I've got nearly 100 in it now, and yet we were brought up to think there were just us 5.